In this video, we will learn 3 different ways to add CSS to an HTML page. Because these techniques are often used in synchrony, we will also explore how they cascade together to determine the final styling of the page when conflicts arise. You may be familiar with the in-file block method of CSS insertion. In this method, a style tag is added to the page's header. And any CSS rules that we declare within this style tag will automatically apply to this local page. We need to recognize that most websites are comprised of more than one HTML page, and sometimes we'll want to apply the same style sheet to all or many of these pages. When this occurs, the in-file block method is weak because it allows us to style only one page at a time. We would have to copy large blocks of CSS into the headers of all of our pages. When we'd like to write a style sheet that will be used for multiple HTML pages, it's generally a good idea to put that style sheet in a separate .css file. This is, of course, the separate file method of CSS insertion. If you'll look above the style tag on this page, you'll see a link element. This link element contains 3 values. We've informed the browser that we're linking to a style sheet. We've told it the type of style sheet. And here, this href value tells the browser where to find the style sheet. I've simply told it to look for 3ways.css, which I know is in the same folder as my 3ways.html web page, which is the page we're looking at right now. If your style sheets are in a separate folder from your HTML pages, you're generally going to have to provide that path. Let's open up that style sheet right now. So right now our external CSS file is empty. After all I did to create it was generate a new text file and rename the extension from .txt to .css. There's no special syntax associated with external CSS files. All we need to do is start writing CSS code, and any HTML page that links to it will automatically pull from the file. The question we should be asking ourselves, though, is how does a web browser determine whether to give priority to the rules in our external CSS or in the in-file block CSS? To explore this, of course, we're going to pit these 2 sections of CSS against each other. Previously, in our in-file block, we declared the rule all paragraph elements have red text. Now we're going to declare in our external file that all paragraph elements are sporting blue text. And let's see what happens. Even after refreshing our page, we still see the red text described in our in-file block rule, not the blue text described by our external file CSS. This is the behavior we would expect to see if both paragraph rules were defined in the same location, with the red paragraph rule defined after the blue paragraph rule. Because both rules are equally specific, we know that CSS will give priority to the rule defined later. That's essentially what's happening here. When the web browser interprets our web page, it goes through the CSS and external files before the CSS in file, making the external file CSS code that is essentially placed before our in-file code. If this is all there is to it, we would expect that the blue rule would become stronger than the red rule if it had a more specific selector. So let's use the class selector now, and of course apply it to one of our paragraph elements, and take a look. Just as we expected, the separate file text is now blue rather than red, because we used a class selector to define its text color rather than the more general single element type selector, which was used to describe the red text. Now that we're familiar with the interaction between separate file CSS and in-file block CSS, it's time to take a look at inline CSS. Inline CSS is a technique in which we insert CSS directly into the opening tag of an element. We do this by giving the element the style attribute. And between these quotation marks, we can write normal CSS. For example, here I've made it so that this paragraph is both green and boldface font. What we achieve with inline CSS can generally be achieved through ID selectors. For this reason, it's sometimes seen as extraneous and cluttering. It's very important to realize that inline CSS takes priority over all other CSS rules, with one distinct exception that I'm about to show you. But first, let's make sure that our inline CSS rule worked and take a look at our page again. Fantastic. The paragraph element that we've just styled looks as expected, green with boldface font. We've learned a lot in this video about how the CSS cascade operates, what styling attributes manifest when they come into conflict with the attributes of other rules. Before we go, I'd like to show you a way to circumvent the cascade to some degree. That's the important flag. If we flag a rule as important, it now takes priority over all other rules, even inline CSS, if these rules are not also flagged important. If two rules flagged important come into conflict, the normal rules of resolution apply. So now, by flagging that general, least specific rule important, it applies in all instances. After viewing this video, I hope that you're comfortable adding CSS to your pages using the separate file, in-file block, and inline systems. I also hope that you've gained some understanding into how web pages determine which CSS attributes take priority when these systems are used in synchrony.